He was born into a way of life most men only read about. From the beginning, the world around DJ Shipley was a platoon hut, a rifle rack, and the quiet gravity of men who had chosen, or been chosen, to stand between others and chaos. It is the sort of childhood that teaches a boy two things: how to be useful and how to hold his tongue. On a small farm in Chesapeake, chores were not chores, they were schooling. He rose with the animals, learned responsibility the hard way, and learned that the measure of a person in that family was in action, not words. His father was a SEAL. The team was not a job, it was the horizon he measured himself against. There were lessons everywhere. Mornings began before sunrise, the smell of diesel and salt air mixing in the yard as his father ran him through drills disguised as games. He learned to tie knots before he learned to drive, to swim distances that frightened most adults, to move quietly, to listen, really listen, for small things that most people ignore. Every challenge, every scraped knee or split knuckle was met not with sympathy, but with a nod that said, "Good, you're learning." It was discipline by design, a slow apprenticeship into resilience. That upbringing built a foundation that few can comprehend. The house was filled with symbols of service, plaques, faded photographs, tridents on the wall, quiet reminders that greatness was not just expected, it was assumed. For DJ, the line between childhood and the warrior's path was invisible. He didn't dream of becoming a SEAL because it was glamorous. He believed it was inevitable. In that world, the standard was excellence, and anything less simply didn't exist. Yet there was another gravity, quieter but no less binding, a small scraped temple of asphalt and concrete called a skate park. He fell in love with speed and balance, with the tiny private victories of landing a trick. Skateboarding became an obsession, a place to live between deployments, a place that taught him to commit and to take calculated risks. Still, the path was assumed, the team awaited. At 17, he walked into boot camp and in short order into the crucible that makes a SEAL. He went to Buds the hard way, without an A-school contract, a gamble that might have sent him away from the teams if things had gone differently. He was young, stubborn, and, as he later admitted, too dumb to quit. Hell Week was not a storybook trial, it was a furnace that burned out excuses and left the shape of a man who would keep walking into the impossible. The first taste of war arrived soon after. He was 19 and in Iraq. Months of drills, PSD shifts, night drives with no armor, the nervous electricity of men waiting for something to happen. They were young and in many ways untested. The reality of combat, the unpredictability, the moral questions of target discrimination, the constant breath hold of leaving a compound and waiting for shadows to move, arrived like a cold wind. He spoke later of smelling ambushes in the air, of routes that might be the last thing he'd ever see. In those early years, the community learned to mourn together. A helicopter went down and the pain radiated through the teams, touching men who had known and would come to know loss. The enormity of those events would only sink in later, but for now, they altered the ledger of what was possible. The immutable idea that the team was invincible gave way, slowly and painfully, to a new realism. His second deployment would prove to be the moment training met unadorned reality. They called one target the Karma House. Entry would be textbook, helos to the front door, a hard blow, except that in war, danger rarely reads the textbook. Inside that house and on the roof above, the enemy had planned for death. Bursts of gunfire, the snap of grenades, a belt-fed weapon chewing a hallway. That night they ran into the full, terrible commitment of men who would not surrender. He remembers the moment at 6 feet, a man charging with a pistol raised. He fired, so did the man in his face. When the magazine cleared and when the dust settled, he found a round lodged in the edge of his plate. He had been hit, but the rush and focus of the fight had insulated him. Only later, in the ready room, did the gravity of it become physical. A bullet in his hand, a hole in his nerve sense. The adrenaline that saves you in the firefight delays the shock that follows. They traded grenades on that roof. Men were fragged by ordnance meant to break rooms and roofs. Good men were wounded. The operation was a lesson whose text could not be learned on a training lane. Realism matters, timing matters, and luck, raw, brutal luck, often decides whether a story ends in a stretcher or a debrief. He would be tested again in different ways, in later deployments, in the weight of losses that accumulated across units, and in the slow, grinding aftermath of being a man built to perform. It is one thing to be brave in a moment, it is another to live when that moment becomes a habit, and each return home brings a deeper familiarity with blood and the small mechanical adjustments that keep men alive. Home did not heal everything. He found himself keyed too tight, hypervigilant, obsessively focused on procedure and detail, replaying scenarios until sleep became brittle, relationships strained. He admits now that he drank to dull the edges, later realizing that the very behaviors that kept him sharp in a war zone fractured what he had at home. He describes a period of panic, of mini-strokes of fear that left him in cold sweats. Help seemed risky because being pulled from the job would mean losing the only identity he'd known. Even as the mind tightened, the body began to betray him. Years of deployments, of small injuries that compound, of surgeries, of a medical record growing into 2 volumes eventually led to a med board. The bureaucracy of retirement cut deep, special pays removed, status reduced, the daily equation of who he was slowly changing into a man who was, by institutional measure, broken. The retirement process was not a graceful exit, it was a forced pivot into a world that asked more patience than he felt capable of giving. Out of that pressure came something unexpected. In inpatient treatment, they introduced an exercise he never expected: art therapy. The first few strokes on a blank skateboard deck did not erase a career's worth of pain, but they gave him a place to spill it. He painted, he burned boards by a vintage technique called fracture burning. He found a ritual language to map complex feelings. The work was messy and physical, and it became a new kind of training, a method for staying present. From these boards, Tribe Skates was born, a company that would become a vessel for healing and intentionally for honoring families who had paid the highest price. He did not trade his past for a hobby. He translated experience into purpose. With a former teammate, he co-founded a training outfit, GBRS, that offers high-level instruction and maintains the ethos of meticulous preparation. He teaches the craft, but he also teaches the humility of having been there. The man who once lived to measure himself in performance now measures himself in whether the work helps someone else survive or recover. The arc of his life is not uncommon in its outline: childhood, service, trauma, and reinvention. What makes it distinct is how he chose to refocus his impulses. Where he once sought approval through performance and danger, he now seeks repair through creation. Boards, programs, a company that employs Gold Star family members as a way to keep memory and meaning close. That choice is not sentimental, it is deliberate. It is an active reallocation of the fierce energy that once directed him into conflict. DJ has spoken about regret, about the years he might have left earlier, about things he would do differently, and also about the rare honor of having been part of something where men give everything for people they may never meet. For him, mourning became an act of honoring. He learned to see the families, to hold them, to acknowledge that a life given in loyalty is also a kind of meaning. In the end, the story is not a tidy coda. The scars remain visible and invisible. The bullet in the plate, the bursts on the roof, the long nights of hypervigilance, they did not vanish. But neither did the man's capacity to make, to teach, to channel pain into purpose. Tribe Skates and GBRS are not repudiations of the past. They are continuations of it, repurposed. Where there was once only the metric of performance, there is now a measure of contribution to families, to students, and to a community that still needs the lessons learned in the worst of times. This is not the end of his story. It is a chapter in a life that keeps reconciling memory with the present. The man who fought in palm groves and on roofs now fights different fights, for recovery, for family, for a kind of dignity that heals rather than harms. The lesson he offers is simple and hard. Do not let the job become the only thing that defines you. Find something to build with the pieces left over. Make it matter.